777. Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy points of the horizon, where the sun rises at the summer and winter solstice. CD represents the front of the temple. The star indicates the point from which the imaginary or actual lines, as the case may be, are required to be drawn, so as to intersect the points A and B, by passing through the corners of the temple, thus making the front the chord of an arc, containing the same number of degrees as a GB. The other letters indicate the points of the compass. By the use of a plumb line, a point corresponding to the star might, if required, be established on the roof. This, however, would not be necessary if, as was generally the case, the principal entrances of the temple conducted into an open court, ornamented by rows of pillars. The whole arrangement, if correctly inaugurated by placing the cornerstone in its true position, in the northeast corner, would enable an observer, by use of the most simple and primitive instruments, to determine when the sun reached either of the equinoctial or solstitial points. Or, in other words, enabling him to divide the year into its 4 great natural divisions, and accurately mark the commencement of each. The length of the solar year could also thus be determined, that is, full as accurately as the ancients did determine it. All of these particulars might, indeed, be ascertained without any instruments whatever, by means of the pillars at the porch. All ancient temples had 2 lofty pillars, one at each corner of the porch, and there is no doubt that they had some connection with the arrangement above described. If they were located with care, the rising sun of the summer solstice would cast the shadow of the northeastern pillar, Boaz, along the line as see figure 4, and the rising sun of the winter solstice cast the shadow of the other pillar, Jachin, along the line 5. Careful observations would also probably be made of the length as well as direction of these shadows at different periods of the year, for at noon on the day of the summer solstice, the sun being higher in the heavens than at any other time in the year, the shadows of the columns would be shortest. And 172. Chapter 8. Astronomical explanations continued. At noon on the winter solstice the shadows would be the longest 8. These observations of the length of the shadows, being made at noon, would be free from the error occasioned by refraction at sunrise, and thus serve to correct the others. If these pillars were thus secretly used by the priests for astronomical purposes, it fully accounts for the idea always entertained, but never entirely understood, that the pillars themselves had some connection, actual or emblematic, with the solstitial or equinoctial points. The following drawing will clearly illustrate the probable astronomical uses of the pillars of the porch in ancient Egyptian temples. The sun is rising. It is the hour of the morning sacrifice. The pavement of the temple is represented as open to the sky, for the purpose of more easy illustration. It need not have been so in fact, as it is only required that the shadow of the column at sunrise should fall parallel to the solstitial line, which could have been determined from without. In the ancient Egyptian temples, however, the portico and courts leading to the sanctuary were open and uncovered. See Wilkinson's Ancient Egyptians. And the shadows of the columns were projected on the floor. The checkered floor, whenever it was considered necessary to have the solstitial lines or the length of the shadow actually marked on the floor, then a certain carefully placed line or row of mosaic squares, see illustration, would answer the purpose, and also perfectly conceal the design of the whole arrangement. And this is probably the reason why the priests in their temple architecture adopted that kind of pavement. Of course, the details of the arrangement were modified to suit different places and circumstances. The observations might be made from the roof, or standing in front of the temple, where instruments, simple in construction, for determining the line of direction toward the rising sun, with reference to the front of the temple, might be, and 173. Stellar Theology and Masonic Astronomy. The rising sun of the summer solstice probably were used, without relying wholly on the shadows cast by the columns. The mean daily rate at which the point of sunrise moved along the horizon, and the length of the shadows increased or diminished, would also soon be determined. And thus an observation could be taken at sunrise, noon, and sunset, any day. The month and day of the month could thus be determined at any time with tolerable accuracy. The same arrangement would serve to ascertain the true solar time. Of course, it is now impossible, in the absence of any direct information, to arrive at all the details of the peculiar arrangement by which these ancient solar observations were made. But the main outline is without doubt correct. It was but a more extended application of the principle of the sundial, by means of which not only the hours of the day but the arrival of the sun at the solstitial and equinoctial points was determined, together with the length of the year and other important particulars. These methods seem clumsy to us, being familiar with the wonderful instruments of precision which modern science possesses. But, in those ancient days, such primitive methods were the only ones known, and the accuracy of the results arrived at is a matter of wonder and surprise. 174. Chapter 8. Astronomical explanations continued. The whole arrangement of the porch and pillars of ancient temples for astronomical uses thus depended to a great extent upon the accurate laying of the cornerstone in the northeast corner, so that the outer corner of the same should point to exactly the proper place in the circle of the horizon. The great importance attached to the ceremony of laying the cornerstone is thus accounted for. This explanation, although founded partly on conjecture, harmonizes so well with all that is known as to the religious customs and ideas of the ancients, with the facts of astronomical science, and the whole system of solar worship, as to render its truth in the main almost certain. No investigation appears to have ever been made as to the probable connection between astronomy and the porches of ancient temples, beyond the fact, apparent at first sight, that they all face the rising sun. And this is attributed to religious ideas wholly, and not at all to scientific ones. Although it was the well-known custom of the ancient priests to conceal the facts of astronomical science under religious allegories. Those mysterious structures, the pyramids of Egypt, have been more carefully examined, and are found to have been constructed with direct reference to certain astronomical facts, if not uses. The pyramid of Cheops is placed so correctly on the true meridian that the variation of the magnetic needle may be determined by it. It is also so proportional that its height is the radius of a circle whose circumference is equal to the circuit of the pyramid's base. The long slant tunnel, leading downward from the pyramid's northern face, points to the polystar of Cheops' time. Professor R. A. Proctor, the astronomer, says in a late article, The Mystery of the Pyramids, Popular Science Monthly Supplement, No. Ill, that the purpose for which the pyramids were erected was in some way associated with astronomy, for the pyramids were built with the most accurate reference to celestial aspects. The following is quoted at length from Mr. Proctor's interesting article. We have italicized 775. A line or two is bearing more particularly on our subject. Mr. Proctor says, these buildings, the pyramids, are all, without exception, built on special astronomical principles. Their square bases are so placed as to have two sides lying east and west, and two lying north and south. Or, in other words, so that their four faces front the four cardinal points. One cannot imagine why a tomb should have such a position. It is not, indeed, easy to understand why any building at all, except an astronomical observatory, should have such a position. A temple, perhaps, devoted to sun worship, and generally to the worship of the heavenly bodies, might be built that way. For it is to be noticed that the peculiar figure and position of the pyramids would bring about the following relations. When the sun rose and set south of the east and west points, or speaking generally between the autumn and spring equinoxes, the rays of the rising and setting sun illuminated the southern face of the pyramid. Whereas during the rest of the year, that is, during the 6 months between the spring and autumn equinoxes, the rays of the rising and setting sun illuminated the northern face. Again, all the year around the sun's rays passed from the eastern to the western face at solar noon. And, lastly, during 7 months and a half of each year, namely, for 3 months and 3/4 before and after midsummer, the noon rays of the sun. 176. Chapter 8. Astronomical explanations continued. Fell on all four faces of the pyramid, or, according to a Peruvian expression so Smythe says, the sun shone on the pyramid with all his rays. Mr. Proctor thinks the purpose of the pyramids was rather astrological than astronomical, for he says, the slant tunnel above mentioned is precisely what the astrologer would require in order to get the horoscope correctly. This distinction between astrology and astronomy was unknown to the ancients. The two were one. Astrology assumes, it is true, to predict not only eclipses, but the future generally from the position and aspects of the heavenly bodies. But, in order to make those assumed predictions, it was first required, according to the rules of astrology itself, to obtain a correct knowledge of the position and aspects of the sun, moon, and planets. This necessitated, of course, correct astronomical observations, which might be and were put to use as entirely scientific and practical by the ancients, as well as serving as a basis for their pretended predictions of the future. That the pyramids, whatever else they may have been intended for, were not temples, we are perfectly willing to grant, because the only object which has induced this notice of their astronomical proportions is to show that is a demonstrated fact that the ancient Egyptians did allow the most exact astronomical ideas to greatly influence, if not wholly control, their most stupendous works of architecture, works so gigantic in size, and requiring such an expenditure of time, treasure, labor, and human life, as to render them the greatest wonder of all antiquity. It therefore becomes almost certain that astronomical considerations would not be neglected in the construction of their temples proper, devoted as they were to sun worship, and the service of a religion having a purely astronomical function. In ancient times the only astronomers were the priests, and the only observatories the temples. The mass of the people were ignorant and superstitious, and wholly dependent upon. 177. Stellar theology and Masonic astronomy. The priests for their knowledge required to carry on agriculture. Says Salvardi. From the observations of the stars, the return of the sea, a rational manner, and foretold its probable success with tolerable exactness. The ignorant men, therefore, under his direction, set no bounds in their own minds to the power of science, and doubted not that the futurity of the moral world, as well as that of the physical, was to be read on the face of the starry heavens. In this mistaken idea they were not undeceived by the priests. In order to perpetuate these ideas, and so increase and preserve their power and influence, all scientific knowledge was locked up in the sacerdotal order and the mysteries. Astronomical observations were thus of necessity secretly conducted in the temples, and the methods by which these observations were taken, and the real object of constructions for that purpose, were securely veiled beneath allegorical and religious rites and formulas. The real and scientific reasons why the cornerstone was placed with such care in the northeast corner having been concealed by the priests, in process of time, when their religion was superseded, were entirely lost. The custom, however, was first established under all the sanction and requirements of religion, and came at last to be superstitiously followed, not only as to temples, but all other buildings of any importance, whether built so as to face the east or not. The custom has even descended to this day, which shows that some very important reasons must have led to its adoption in the first place. It is thus that the superstitious observance of this custom required for centuries after the real scientific and the pretended religious reasons for it had not only ceased, but been forgotten. 178.